June 15th, 1985. A date that should have been remembered as one of the happiest days in two people's lives. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery so disturbing that the British government would spend 4 decades trying to ensure it remained hidden from public scrutiny. Sarah Catherine Pemberton and Michael James Ashford were married on June 8, 1985, in a small, intimate ceremony at St. Mary's Church in a quiet village outside of Basingstoke in Hampshire. It was a perfect English summer day, the kind of day that people dream about when they imagine their wedding. The sun was bright but not scorching. There was a gentle breeze that seemed to carry the scent of flowers from the church garden. The sky was the particular shade of blue that seems to only exist in England during late spring or early summer, a blue that photographers try unsuccessfully to capture, but that everyone who was there that day remembers perfectly. The church itself was a centuries-old stone building, the kind of church where generations of families had been married, where countless vows had been exchanged beneath ancient rafters. Inside, light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. The scent of flowers, roses and lilies arranged in careful displays, filled the air. Approximately 150 guests sat in the wooden pews, family members and close friends, people who had gathered to witness two people commit their lives to one another. Sarah walked down the aisle wearing a traditional white wedding dress that had been designed and made by a London designer who specialized in bridal wear. The dress was elegant, but not ostentatious, reflecting Sarah's personal style. Refined, tasteful, understated. She wore her dark hair long, adorned with a simple tiara and a white lace veil. She carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Her face, according to photographs taken that day, showed a mixture of nervousness and genuine happiness. She was smiling, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was also aware of the significance of the moment, aware that her life was about to change forever. Michael stood at the altar waiting for her, his face breaking into a broad smile as he caught sight of her. He was dressed in a formal morning suit, the traditional dress for English weddings of this class and formality. He looked handsome and confident, a young man who appeared to have no doubts about the decision he was making, no hesitations about the future he was choosing. When Sarah reached the altar, Michael took her hand. According to descriptions from people who were present at the ceremony, in that moment when he took her hand, something seemed to shift in Sarah's expression. For just an instant, something flickered across her face, a moment of hesitation, perhaps, or a moment of realization about the enormity of what she was about to do. But the moment passed. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed on fingers. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. Michael kissed Sarah, and the congregation applauded. They had no way of knowing that this would be the last moment of their lives when they existed as ordinary people, living ordinary lives in the ordinary world. After the ceremony, there was a reception at a local hotel, with champagne and a catered meal, a tiered wedding cake that a professional baker had spent days creating, a dance floor where family members and friends celebrated the union of two families and the beginning of a marriage. Sarah's mother, Catherine Ashton Pemberton, spent much of the reception crying happy tears, telling anyone who would listen how proud she was of her daughter, and how happy she was that Sarah had found such a good man to spend her life with. Michael's father, John Ashford, gave a toast that was warm and welcoming, publicly embracing his new daughter-in-law, and expressing his genuine pleasure at the marriage. Sarah's younger sister, Emma, was a bridesmaid, and she spent the reception telling friends how beautiful the ceremony had been, and how much she loved her new brother-in-law. By all accounts, it was the kind of wedding that people remember for years afterward. Beautiful, dignified, filled with genuine emotion and celebration. That evening, as the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah and Michael prepared to depart for the first part of their honeymoon. The plan was to drive to London, spend 2 nights at a luxury hotel, and then fly to Greece for a 2-week vacation. Michael had borrowed his father's car for the drive, a late-model Mercedes, a luxury automobile that reflected the status and wealth of his family. They loaded their luggage into the trunk. Sarah changed out of her wedding dress and into more practical clothing for the drive. Her wedding dress was carefully packed away in a garment bag to be dealt with later. Before they left, Sarah's mother embraced her daughter one more time, holding her close in a way that suggested she was reluctant to let go, as if some part of her sensed that something was about to happen. "Have a wonderful time," Catherine said to Sarah. "You deserve to be happy. Michael is a good man. Take care of each other." Sarah reassured her mother that everything would be fine, that she and Michael would call when they arrived at the hotel in London, that she would tell her mother all about the honeymoon when they returned. Michael shook hands with Sarah's father, Richard Pemberton, who told Michael to take good care of his daughter, and Michael assured him that he would. By 7 o'clock in the evening on June 8, 1985, Sarah and Michael were driving north from Hampshire toward London. The drive would take approximately 2 hours, depending on traffic. According to later investigation, they drove north on the M3 motorway toward London. They stopped at a service station to use the facilities and to buy snacks and drinks for the final part of the journey. An attendant at the service station would later report that he remembered seeing a young couple who seemed to be newlyweds, though he couldn't be entirely certain of the specifics. By approximately 9 o'clock in the evening on June 8, 1985, Sarah and Michael arrived at the Regency Hotel in Camden, North London. The hotel was one of London's more exclusive and expensive establishments. Not a large chain hotel, but rather an independently owned luxury hotel that catered to wealthy individuals and couples seeking a refined, intimate experience. The hotel occupied a converted Georgian townhouse, 5 stories tall, with only 25 rooms total. The rooms were furnished with antique furniture and original artwork. The service was personalized and attentive. The price, approximately £300 per night in 1985, equivalent to roughly £900 in modern currency, reflected the exclusivity of the establishment. Michael's family had booked the suite as a wedding gift. It was one of the hotel's premium rooms, located on the 3rd floor, overlooking a quiet street in the Camden district. The suite consisted of a bedroom with a king-size bed, a separate living room, a marble-floored bathroom with a soaking tub and a separate shower, and a small kitchenette where guests could order food to be prepared and served in the room. The hotel staff welcomed them warmly, offering congratulations and assistance with their luggage. The concierge had prepared a welcome basket: champagne, chocolates, fresh fruit, flowers. The hotel manager had personally ensured that the suite was perfectly prepared, with soft lighting and fresh flowers in the bedroom and sitting room. Sarah and Michael were shown to their suite by a porter who helped them with their luggage and explained the amenities available to them. The porter showed them how to order from room service, how to use the telephone system, how to adjust the lighting and heating. He explained that the hotel staff was available 24 hours a day for any requests they might have. After the porter left, Sarah and Michael stood in the sitting room of their suite, alone together for the first time as a married couple. According to Michael's father's later account, based on a phone conversation he had with Michael the following day, Michael said that they had opened the champagne that was waiting for them, that they had looked out the window at the London street below, that they had talked about how happy they were, how much they were looking forward to Greece, how much they loved each other. At some point during the evening, they went to bed, and then, in the early morning hours of June 9, 1985, something happened that would change their lives forever, or perhaps more accurately, would end their lives as anyone understood them. To understand what happened to Sarah and Michael, we must first understand who they were as individuals, because their story is not the story of marginal people, or people whose disappearance might easily be explained away. This is the story of 2 young people from successful, connected families, people whose disappearance demanded investigation and whose cases should never have been allowed to vanish into obscurity. Sarah Catherine Pemberton was born on March 14, 1961, in London. Her father, Richard Pemberton, was a senior executive at the Bank of England, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the world. Her mother, Catherine Ashton Pemberton, came from a family with historical connections to the British aristocracy. Her family traced its lineage back several centuries, and included various members who had held positions in government and business. Sarah's childhood was comfortable and intellectually stimulating in equal measure. She grew up in a large house in Surrey, attended by household staff, surrounded by books and art and music. Her parents valued education and expected their children, though Sarah was their only daughter, to excel academically and to become accomplished and cultivated individuals. From an early age, Sarah showed exceptional ability in the sciences. By the time she was in primary school, she was already reading books about chemistry and biology that were typically designed for students several years older. She conducted experiments in the kitchen, mixing household chemicals together and observing the results with the kind of fascination that suggests a genuine passion for understanding how the natural world works. Teachers at her private school recognized her exceptional ability and encouraged her to pursue advanced studies in the sciences. By the time she was in secondary school, she was taking chemistry and biology courses that were designed for sixth form students several years older than herself. She excelled in these courses and began to develop a clear sense that her future would involve scientific research. She was also a well-rounded student. She studied languages. She spoke fluent French and conversational German, and was accomplished in literature and history. She was an accomplished pianist, having studied music from childhood, and could play complex pieces with technical proficiency and emotional depth. But beyond her academic abilities, what distinguished Sarah from many other brilliant students was her emotional intelligence and her ability to relate to people from different backgrounds. She was not the stereotype of the brilliant but socially awkward student. Rather, she was someone who could move comfortably between different social worlds, who could talk intelligently with scholars about scientific research, and also engage in genuine conversation with people who had no particular scientific interests. When Sarah went to study at the University of Cambridge, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, she brought this combination of abilities with her. At Cambridge, she continued to excel academically. She studied chemistry with a particular focus on organic chemistry and biochemistry. Her work was noticed by her professors, who encouraged her to pursue graduate research and to consider an academic career. But Sarah also had a life outside of her studies. She enjoyed literature and attended theatrical productions at the college. She was part of a group of friends who spent time together discussing everything from politics to philosophy to personal relationships. She was known for her thoughtfulness and her ability to listen carefully to other people's perspectives, even when she disagreed with them. During her time at Cambridge, Sarah had several romantic relationships. Nothing serious, but experiences that were part of her development as a young adult. She was attractive, intelligent, and personable, qualities that attracted the attention of various young men. But she was also somewhat selective about who she spent time with. She did not seem interested in casual relationships or in the kind of superficial social connections that many of her peers pursued. After completing her degree at Cambridge with first-class honors, Sarah took a position as a research chemist at Merck Pharmaceuticals in Surrey. The position was exactly the kind of career that her education and talent had prepared her for. She was assigned to work on research related to the development of cardiovascular medications. The research was complex and challenging, involving the analysis of potential drug compounds and their effects on various biological systems. Sarah excelled in this work. She was diligent and careful in her research, meticulous in her data collection and analysis. She collaborated well with her colleagues, and she contributed meaningfully to research projects that had genuine potential to lead to the development of new medical treatments. Her supervisors recognized her potential and believed that she was destined for a significant career in pharmaceutical research. But Sarah was also a young woman with personal interests and desires that extended beyond her career. She loved literature and music as much as she loved chemistry. She was interested in the world around her, in politics, in social issues, in human relationships. She had friends, though a relatively small circle of close friends, rather than a large social network. She was engaged in the world, but in a quiet, thoughtful way. Michael James Ashford was born on September 7, 1959, in Kensington, London. He was the eldest son of John Ashford, a prominent businessman with extensive interests in banking and real estate, and Margaret Blackwood Ashford, whose family connections extended into the upper reaches of British society. Margaret's family had been involved in business and government for several generations, and included members who had held positions of significant influence and power. Michael's childhood had been one of privilege and expectation. He had been born into a world of wealth and social status, a world where doors seemed to open automatically, where people knew his name and his family connections, where the future seemed preordained to include success and prominence. He had attended Eton College, the most prestigious private school in Britain, from the age of 13. Eton had educated the sons of aristocrats, industrialists, and prominent professionals for centuries. Many prime ministers had attended Eton. Many members of parliament had attended Eton. To attend Eton was to be part of an exclusive network that extended throughout British society, in government, in business, in law, in academia. At Eton, Michael had been academically strong but not exceptional. His true strengths lay in social navigation and in his natural charm. He was handsome, confident, and possessed of an easy manner that made people comfortable in his presence. He was popular among his peers and successful with girls. He was talented at sports, particularly at rowing and cricket. He was the kind of student that teachers remembered, not for his academic achievements, but for his personality and his social skills. After completing his studies at Eton, Michael went on to study law at Oxford University. Oxford, like Cambridge, was one of the world's most prestigious universities, and studying law at Oxford positioned Michael for entry into one of the most respected professions in Britain. At Oxford, Michael continued to excel socially while being adequate, but not exceptional academically. He joined the university's rowing club and competed at a high level. He was involved in various social organizations and societies. He made friends easily and was known for his charm and his confidence. After completing his degree at Oxford, Michael articled, essentially apprenticed, with a prestigious London law firm. This apprenticeship, known as articles, was the standard path for someone wishing to become a barrister, trial lawyer, rather than a solicitor, office-based lawyer, in Britain. After completing his articles, Michael was called to the bar in 1984, at the age of 25. He immediately began practicing as a barrister, meaning that he could appear in court and represent clients in legal proceedings. By 1985, at the age of 26, he was developing a reputation as a competent and intelligent trial lawyer. His appearance and his confidence served him well in the courtroom, where jurors responded well to his manner and his presentation. But Michael's personal life was less settled than his professional trajectory. He had had several relationships before meeting Sarah, relationships that had tended to end because of his tendency to become bored, or to believe that the women in his life were not sufficiently interesting or accomplished. He was the kind of man who seemed to be constantly seeking something, though perhaps not entirely sure what he was seeking. Michael's colleagues noted that he had a tendency toward arrogance. There was an assumption about him that rules that applied to others might not apply to him, that his social status and his family connections gave him a kind of immunity from ordinary consequences. He could be charming and engaging, but he could also be dismissive of people he considered his inferiors. He could be generous to his friends, but unkind to people he felt were beneath his notice. Sarah and Michael had been introduced to one another at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends in London in late 1983. The party was held at the home of one of Michael's colleagues from his law firm, someone who knew people from Michael's social circle and also knew Sarah through her work in pharmaceuticals. Michael had been immediately attracted to Sarah, partly by her physical appearance, certainly, but also by her intelligence and her quiet confidence. She was beautiful without being vain about her appearance. She was intelligent in a way that suggested genuine understanding rather than mere intellectual show. She was present and thoughtful in conversation, interested in what other people had to say, rather than merely waiting for her turn to speak. For her part, Sarah had been intrigued by Michael, by his legal knowledge, by his confidence in social situations, by his charm and his apparent success, but she had also been somewhat wary of him. She sensed something in him, a kind of superficiality beneath the charm, a lack of genuine interest in the inner lives of other people, a tendency to view the world through the lens of his own interests and desires. But she was also young, and Michael was undeniably attractive and charming. And so when he suggested that they should get to know each other better, she agreed. Their relationship developed gradually and deliberately over the following 2 years. They went on dates, to restaurants, to concerts, to museums, to social events. They became intimate. They met each other's families. Michael's family welcomed Sarah warmly. She was intelligent, from a good family, accomplished, exactly the kind of woman they would want their son to marry. Sarah's family was somewhat more cautious in their welcome of Michael. Richard and Catherine Pemberton appreciated his charm and his professional accomplishments, but they seemed to sense something in him that gave them pause. Catherine in particular seemed to harbor some reservations, though she was too polite and too careful of social conventions to express these reservations explicitly. But gradually, as Michael continued to treat Sarah well, and as Sarah's affection for him seemed genuine, her family came to accept the relationship and to believe that Michael was, in fact, a good match for their daughter. By late 1984, Michael had proposed to Sarah. He had done so in a thoughtful way, bringing her to a romantic restaurant in London and presenting her with an engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a traditional diamond ring set in white gold. Sarah had accepted the proposal, and they had begun planning their wedding. The wedding had been planned for June 1985, approximately 6 months after the proposal. It was to be a traditional English wedding, elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting the tastes and values of both families. Both Sarah and Michael seemed happy about the upcoming marriage. There were no visible signs of doubt or hesitation, no indication that either of them had second thoughts about the commitment they were making. The morning of June 9, 1985, began unremarkably at the Regency Hotel in Camden. The hotel staff came on duty at their various shifts: housekeeping staff, front desk staff, room service staff, maintenance personnel. It was a Sunday morning, relatively quiet as Sunday mornings at hotels tend to be, with fewer guests checking in or out than would typically be the case on weekdays. By approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, the assistant manager on duty, a woman named Patricia Sinclair, noticed that the newlyweds who had checked in the previous evening had not yet emerged from their suite or requested any room service. This was not particularly unusual. Guests at the Regency often slept late, and the hotel staff was trained to be respectful of guest privacy and not to disturb them unnecessarily. But by noon, when the couple still had not made any contact with the hotel and had not responded to a telephone call attempting to confirm their plans for lunch, Patricia Sinclair began to become mildly concerned. Hotel protocol, particularly at a luxury hotel, where the staff was trained to be attentive to guests' needs, included checking on guests who had not made any contact for an extended period. Patricia Sinclair discussed the situation with the head of housekeeping, Margaret Thornton. Margaret had been employed at the Regency for 12 years and was highly experienced and professional in her approach to her work. Patricia explained that the newlyweds had not made any contact since they had checked in the previous evening. She asked Margaret to go to the suite and knock on the door, ostensibly to offer housekeeping services, but actually to check on the guests and ensure that nothing was amiss. Margaret Thornton, at approximately 12:30 p.m., took her housekeeping cart to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of the suite occupied by Sarah and Michael Ashford. She identified herself and offered housekeeping services. There was no response. Margaret knocked again, more firmly this time. Still no response. Margaret used her key to unlock the door and entered the suite. She called out, identifying herself as housekeeping staff. Still no response. As Margaret entered the suite, she became immediately aware that something was wrong. The sitting room was empty. There was no sign of the couple. The bedroom was empty as well. The bathroom was empty. Margaret left the suite immediately and went downstairs to inform Patricia Sinclair that the guests appeared to have left, though she did not immediately understand that they had simply vanished. Patricia Sinclair asked Margaret to describe the state of the suite. Margaret reported that the suite appeared to be empty, but that the guests' luggage was still in the room, their clothing was still in the closet, and their personal items were still in the bathroom. This was unusual. If the couple had left, they would presumably have taken their luggage and their personal items with them. Patricia Sinclair immediately went upstairs to examine the suite herself. She confirmed Margaret's observations. The suite was empty of the guests, but all of their belongings appeared to be still in the room. More troubling still, the bed had not been slept in, or rather, it appeared to have been slept in, but the bedding had been carefully straightened afterward, in a way that suggested someone had made deliberate efforts to make it appear unused. In the sitting room, Patricia noticed something else. The furniture appeared to have been rearranged or disturbed. There were marks on the floor and on the walls that suggested movement or struggle. There was a faint smell in the air, nothing overwhelming, but something that seemed slightly out of place, though Patricia could not immediately identify what it was. More troubling still, on the bedside table in the bedroom, Patricia found Sarah's wedding ring and her engagement ring. They were placed carefully next to a glass of water, as if someone had deliberately removed the rings and positioned them to be found. Patricia Sinclair immediately understood that something serious had occurred. She contacted the hotel manager, and the hotel manager contacted the police. By early afternoon on June 9, 1985, Scotland Yard had dispatched officers to the Regency Hotel in Camden. The first police officers to arrive at the Regency Hotel were uniformed officers responding to a report of missing guests. They examined the suite and immediately recognized that the situation was more serious than a simple case of guests leaving without checking out. The hotel manager provided them with information about the guests, their names, their backgrounds, when they had checked in. The officers used this information to begin preliminary inquiries. Within hours, senior officers had been called to the scene. Detective Inspector Robert Harrison, a senior investigator with Scotland Yard, arrived at the hotel in mid-afternoon on June 9th. Harrison was an experienced investigator in his mid-40s, with expertise in serious crimes, including homicide and disappearances. Harrison immediately recognized several disturbing factors about the case. First, the couple had disappeared without taking any of their belongings. Second, Sarah's wedding rings had been left behind, deliberately positioned on the bedside table. Third, there was evidence of a struggle in the suite. Fourth, given the status of both families involved, this case would attract significant attention and would require serious investigative resources. Harrison ordered the suite to be secured as a crime scene. He called in forensic specialists. He began organizing preliminary interviews with hotel staff and guests who had been staying in the hotel at the time of the disappearance. By early evening on June 9, 1985, the case had become significant enough that it was being handled by senior officers at Scotland Yard. Detective Chief Inspector Richard Thorne, one of Scotland Yard's most experienced investigators, was assigned to lead the investigation. Thorne was an experienced investigator in his early 50s, with expertise in serious crime investigation. He was known as a methodical investigator who relied on evidence and procedure, rather than on intuition or speculation. He was respected by his colleagues and was known for his ability to organize complex investigations and to maintain focus on evidence. Thorne's first action was to expand the investigation to include the families of both Sarah and Michael. He personally made telephone calls to inform the families of the disappearance. These were among the most difficult telephone calls that Thorne would make in his career, calls in which he had to inform parents that their children had disappeared. Under mysterious circumstances, Richard Pemberton, Sarah's father, initially could not believe what he was being told. His daughter, who had been married just the day before, who had been happy and excited about her honeymoon, was missing, just like that, gone. Catherine Pemberton, Sarah's mother, became hysterical. She wanted to know if her daughter was safe. She wanted to know what had happened. She wanted police to find her immediately. John Ashford, Michael's father, responded with a kind of shock and disbelief. His son, who had called him the previous evening to confirm that he and Sarah had arrived safely at the hotel, was now missing. Thorne assured the families that he would do everything within his power to find their children and to determine what had happened to them. Thorne's investigation began with a systematic examination of the suite where Sarah and Michael had disappeared. Forensic specialists examined every surface, collected samples, photographed everything. What they found was disturbing in its implications. The bloodstains found in the suite were analyzed. All of the blood was determined to be human blood. The blood types found were consistent with Sarah's and Michael's blood types. This indicated that both Sarah and Michael had been bleeding at some point while they were in the suite, but the amount of blood was not extensive. It was not consistent with serious injuries or with violence that would have resulted in death or incapacitation. It was as if both Sarah and Michael had suffered minor injuries, perhaps scratches or minor cuts, during whatever had occurred. The marks on the walls and on the furniture were examined. Forensic specialists determined that the marks were consistent with something or someone having been dragged forcefully across the surfaces. The marks on the bed frame were examined and were determined to be consistent with rope or cord, having been wound around the frame and then removed. This suggested that at some point, Sarah and Michael had been physically restrained, tied to the bed, essentially, though for how long and for what purpose could not be determined. Most significant to the investigation was what Thorne found on the bathroom mirror. Written in what appeared to be lipstick or some other substance was a single word: choose. Thorne immediately understood the significance of this. This was not random vandalism. This was a deliberate message, written by someone with clear intentionality. But what did it mean? What was being communicated by this single word? Thorne hypothesized several possibilities. Perhaps it was a message intended to be discovered by investigators, a clue of some kind. Perhaps it was a message directed at Sarah or Michael, or to someone who knew them. Perhaps it was a reference to something, to a choice that Sarah and Michael had made, or to a choice that was being forced upon them. On the bedside table, where Sarah's wedding ring and engagement ring had been found, Thorne considered the significance of their placement. Rings left behind, particularly by a bride who had only been married the day before, suggested something significant. Perhaps they indicated that Sarah's previous life, her life before marriage, was being rejected or abandoned. Perhaps they indicated something else entirely. The most crucial piece of evidence, however, was the security footage. The Regency Hotel, being an exclusive and expensive establishment with a concern for security and for maintaining records of who was in the hotel at any given time, had security cameras covering the main areas of the hotel: the lobby, the hallways, the elevator areas, the front entrance. These cameras were monitored and recorded on videotape, a technology that was becoming increasingly common in the early 1980s, though not yet universal in most hotels. Scotland Yard obtained the security footage from the night of June 8th and the morning of June 9th, 1985. Thorne personally reviewed the footage, frame by frame if necessary, looking for any indication of what had happened to Sarah and Michael. What Thorne found on that footage would shock him, and would eventually lead to the decision to classify and suppress the evidence. At approximately 9:15 p.m. on June 8, 1985, the security footage shows Sarah and Michael entering the hotel from the street. They are holding hands, walking together toward the front desk. They appear happy and relaxed. Michael is smiling. Sarah is looking at him with obvious affection. They are clearly newlyweds, clearly happy to be together. They approach the front desk, where the hotel manager greets them and confirms their reservation. The footage shows Michael providing payment information and identification. The footage shows Sarah signing the guest register. Everything appears normal and routine. Michael and Sarah are then shown being directed toward the elevator. They collect their key and their luggage is brought to them by a bellhop. They enter the elevator together, still holding hands, still appearing happy and relaxed. The elevator doors close, and they disappear from view. For the rest of the evening, from approximately 9:30 p.m. through approximately 3:00 a.m., the footage shows the hallways and elevator area as empty. No one enters or exits the third floor. No one disturbs the quiet of the hotel late at night. Then, at approximately 3:15 a.m. on June 9th, Something occurs that would later be described by investigators and by other people who have seen the footage as deeply disturbing and deeply unnatural. The elevator arrives at the 3rd floor and the doors open. 2 figures emerge from the elevator. According to descriptions from investigators who saw the footage, the figures appear to be Sarah and Michael. They are approximately the right height and build. Their general appearance matches descriptions of Sarah and Michael, but something about them is profoundly, disturbingly wrong. Their movements are described by investigators as mechanical and unnatural. They do not move the way normal human beings move. Their gait is described as stiff. Their movements are synchronized in a way that seems disturbing and unnatural. They seem to move as if guided by external forces, or as if they are acting without conscious volition. One investigator, whose account was later documented in classified files, would write, "The manner in which the individuals moved was inconsistent with normal human movement. The synchronization of their movements, the stiffness of their gait, and the apparent lack of individual agency suggested that they were not acting of their own volition. It was as if they were being controlled by some external force or influence." The 2 figures move down the hallway toward their suite, but instead of entering the suite, they continue walking. They walk past the suite and continue down the hallway toward a service stairwell at the end of the hallway, a stairwell marked "Emergency Exit, Authorized Personnel Only." The 2 figures reach the door to the service stairwell. Without hesitation, they open the door, somehow knowing how to open it, somehow having access to it, and they descend into the lower levels of the hotel. The footage shows them disappearing into the stairwell. After that point, they do not reappear on any other camera. They do not emerge from the hotel. They do not exit through the front entrance or the side entrance or any other exit that is captured on the hotel's security cameras. It is as if they simply vanished, as if they ceased to exist in any recognizable way. Thorne reviewed this footage multiple times. He watched it frame by frame. He consulted with other officers and with forensic specialists about what they were seeing. What emerged from these consultations was a sense of deep disturbance and confusion. The way Sarah and Michael moved was not consistent with normal human movement. It appeared to be consistent with someone who was heavily drugged, or heavily sedated, or under the influence of something that affected their motor control. But toxicology tests on the blood evidence found in the suite did not reveal the presence of such substances. It appeared to be consistent with someone who was hypnotized, or under some form of psychological control or influence, but there was no evidence of how such control could have been established, or what its purpose might be, or it appeared to be consistent with something that defied conventional explanation, something involving phenomena or capabilities or forces that were not fully understood, or that were beyond the scope of conventional criminal investigation. Thorne showed the footage to various experts, psychologists, neurologists, toxicologists. All of them were puzzled. None of them could offer a convincing explanation for what they were seeing. One neurologist examining the footage noted that the movement patterns shown in the footage were not consistent with normal human neurology. The synchronized movement of both individuals, the stiffness of their gait, the apparent absence of normal voluntary motor control, all of these suggested something profoundly unusual. The neurologist suggested, tentatively and with obvious discomfort, that the movement patterns could be consistent with external control of motor functions, control that would require technology or capability beyond what conventional science understood to be possible. When pressed, the neurologist refused to elaborate further, expressing discomfort with the direction the discussion was taking, and indicating that he did not want to speculate about matters beyond the scope of conventional neurology. But the implication had been stated. The movement patterns shown in the security footage suggested something that was not normal, something that was not adequately explained by conventional criminal investigation, something that approached, if one allowed the thought to proceed that far, the realm of science, fiction, or the unexplained. Thorne's investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and Michael Ashford proceeded with intensity and dedication in the days and weeks following their disappearance. Thorne organized search teams to comb the lower levels of the hotel, examining the service areas, the basement, any place where Sarah and Michael might have been taken, but nothing was found, no trace of them, no indication of where they had gone after they entered the service stairwell. Thorne interviewed all available hotel staff, examining their movements, their access to various areas of the hotel, their potential involvement in the disappearance. What he found was that several staff members could not clearly account for their whereabouts during the critical time period between 11:47 p.m. on June 8th and 3:15 a.m. on June 9th. One staff member, in particular, drew Thorne's attention, a man named David Cromwell, who worked as a maintenance person at the hotel. Cromwell had been on duty during the night in question. He had access to all areas of the hotel, including the service areas, the security systems, and the emergency exits. When Thorne interviewed Cromwell, the man seemed evasive and nervous. He could not clearly account for his whereabouts during the critical time period. Thorne pushed harder. He obtained phone records for Cromwell. He reviewed Cromwell's employment history. He discovered that Cromwell had worked at several other hotels in London over the past decade, and that at each location there had been incidents of unusual thefts, disappearances of guest property, or other mysterious occurrences that had never been fully explained. More troubling still, Thorne discovered that Cromwell's background included several criminal convictions. Nothing violent, but convictions related to fraud and to unauthorized access to secure areas. Cromwell appeared to be someone with the knowledge, the access, and the potential motive to be involved in whatever had happened to Sarah and Michael. Thorne began to develop a theory. Perhaps Cromwell had been involved in some kind of scheme to abduct or exploit the Newlyweds. Perhaps he had been working with others. Perhaps Sarah and Michael had become victims of some kind of organized criminal enterprise, human trafficking perhaps, or organ trafficking, or some other form of exploitation. Thorne intensified his investigation into David Cromwell. He began to compile evidence against him. He interviewed other hotel staff about their interactions with Cromwell. He attempted to determine where Cromwell had been during the critical time period and whether anyone could corroborate his account of his movements. Then, in early July 1985, just weeks into the investigation, something happened that would effectively derail Thorne's promising line of investigation, and that would set the stage for the eventual closure of the case. A superior officer contacted Thorne and told him that the investigation into David Cromwell was to be halted immediately. When Thorne asked why, he was told that the matter was beyond the scope of the current investigation, and that pursuing it further would not be productive. Thorne objected strenuously. He argued that Cromwell seemed to be a highly promising lead, that Cromwell's background and his access to the hotel made him a logical person of interest in the investigation, and that further investigation into Cromwell's activities and movements seemed essential to determining what had happened to Sarah and Michael. He was overruled by his superiors, who made clear that the Cromwell investigation was not to be continued. At the same time, Thorne began to notice something else troubling. The security footage was becoming unavailable. The original tapes that had been taken from the hotel as evidence were being removed from the police evidence files. When Thorne requested access to the tapes to continue his investigation, to show them to other experts, to use them as the basis for further investigative work, he was told that the tapes had been classified and placed in secure storage, accessible only by special authorization from senior officials. Thorne requested this special authorization to access the tapes. His request was denied. Thorne attempted to understand why the tapes had been classified, what national security implications could possibly be involved in security camera footage from a London hotel, why his investigation was being systematically blocked by his own organization. He made inquiries of his superiors about the basis for the classification, about who had authorized it, about what specific national security concerns justified keeping evidence in a missing persons case classified and inaccessible to the investigating officers. His inquiries were met with evasion, with vague references to higher authorities and sensitive matters, with implications that he should not pursue these questions further. By mid-July 1985, just 5 weeks into the investigation, Thorne found himself in an extraordinary position. He was being actively prevented from pursuing what appeared to be the most promising lead in the case. He was being prevented from accessing crucial evidence. He was being directed by his superiors to cease investigation into areas that seemed essential to determining what had happened to Sarah and Michael. In frustration, and in a last attempt to salvage what he believed was becoming a compromised investigation, Thorne wrote a formal memo to his commanding officer expressing his concerns about the direction of the investigation. In the memo, dated July 16, 1985, Thorne wrote, "The investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and Michael Ashford is being systematically hampered by orders from above. Crucial evidence has been removed from the investigation files and classified under apparently dubious national security justifications. A promising line of investigation into David Cromwell has been actively blocked, despite the fact that Cromwell remains a significant person of interest. Forensic evidence that would normally be central to such an investigation has been placed in restricted storage and is inaccessible to investigating officers. Either the investigation should be allowed to proceed unimpeded and according to standard investigative protocols, or it should be officially closed. As it stands, we are neither adequately investigating the case nor resolving it. We are simply burying it, and doing so in a manner that suggests involvement by higher authorities in the obstruction of justice." The memo was scathing in its implications. It suggested that official forces within Scotland Yard itself were engaged in obstructing the investigation. It suggested that there were people in positions of authority who had reasons for not wanting the case to be solved, or for wanting certain information to remain hidden. Thorne's memo appears to have had little effect beyond making his superiors aware that he was becoming a problem, an officer who was asking the wrong questions and who was not accepting official directives to cease investigation. The response came in August 1985. Thorne was called into a meeting with a very senior official, a commander at Scotland Yard, who was not directly involved in the investigation, but who had apparent authority to make decisions about how cases should be handled. In the meeting, Thorne was told that he was to cease all investigative work on the Ashford case. The investigation was being taken out of his hands. A small senior team would take over the case, but Thorne was to have no further involvement. When Thorne asked why he was being removed from the case, he was told simply that the matter has become sensitive, and that his further involvement was not in the interests of the investigation. Thorne protested. He argued that he was in the middle of pursuing important leads, that removing him from the case at this point would compromise the investigation. He was told that his objections were noted, but that the decision had been made at levels above his authority and was not subject to negotiation or further discussion. In September 1985, just 3 months after Sarah and Michael had disappeared, Detective Chief Inspector Richard Thorne was formally removed from the Ashford investigation. The case was officially closed. Not closed in the sense of being solved. Not closed because investigators had determined what had happened and had prosecuted those responsible. Rather, closed in the sense of being abandoned, sealed, filed away into restricted storage, where it would not be subject to ongoing investigation or public scrutiny. The case files were classified. The security footage was classified. Investigation materials were moved into secure storage, and the official position became that there was no further information to be provided about the case, to the public, to the families, to anyone. Thorne objected to the closure of the case in writing. He submitted formal written objections to the decision. He attempted to appeal to even higher officials, but he was overruled. The decision to close the case had apparently been made at a level of authority that was beyond his ability to challenge. Thorne continued to work for Scotland Yard, but he was never again assigned to work on the Ashford case. Colleagues noted that he seemed diminished by the experience, that he expressed concern about the manner in which the case had been handled, but seemed resigned to the fact that there was nothing he could do about it. Thorne retired from Scotland Yard in 1990. In his retirement, he submitted one last formal request that the Ashford case be reopened. His request was denied. Thorne died in 1998, taking with him any additional knowledge he might have possessed about the case and about the reasons for its closure. For years after the closure of the investigation, The disappearance of Sarah and Michael Ashford was barely known outside of the immediate families and people who had been directly involved in the investigation. The British media, which might have pursued the story aggressively, seemed to accept the official line that the case was closed and there was nothing further to report. Newspapers ran occasional human interest stories about the young couple's disappearance, but the stories were relatively brief and did not pursue deeper investigation into the questions surrounding the case. After a few years, the stories stopped appearing entirely. It was as if an official decision had been made, at some level of the British government or law enforcement establishment, that the case should be buried, and that the public should not become too interested in investigating it further. But within the families of Sarah and Michael, questions persisted. Their parents wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to their children. They wanted justice, assuming that foul play had been involved in their disappearance. Michael's father, John Ashford, hired private investigators to pursue leads that Scotland Yard had abandoned. These private investigators, operating outside of official constraints, began to compile their own files on the case. They interviewed people who had been involved in the original investigation, though many were reluctant to speak on the record. They attempted to locate and interview David Cromwell, the maintenance person who had drawn Thorne's attention, but Cromwell had apparently left London and could not be easily located. They pursued various theories about what might have happened, but they were hampered by their lack of access to official evidence and to the security footage that might have provided crucial clues. What the private investigators discovered was a picture of official obstruction and suppression that was deeply troubling. They discovered that senior officials at Scotland Yard had made deliberate decisions to suppress the investigation. They discovered evidence suggesting that someone in a position of authority had made decisions about which leads should and should not be pursued. They discovered that the security footage had been deliberately classified and restricted from access. But they also discovered that they were not welcome in pursuing these investigations further. Private investigators received visits from official representatives, sometimes directly from Scotland Yard, sometimes from other government agencies, suggesting that further investigation would not be advisable. The Ashford family received implicit warnings that continuing to pursue the investigation of their son's disappearance might not be in their best interests. These warnings were delivered subtly and never in writing, but they were unmistakable in their meaning. There were people in positions of authority who did not want the case investigated further. There were people who wanted the matter to remain closed and forgotten. Through various sources, some official, some unofficial, information began to leak about the original investigation and about the disturbing nature of the security footage. Police officers who had been involved in the original investigation, speaking on condition of anonymity years later, began to discuss what they had seen. Accounts began to circulate of the disturbing footage showing the young couple moving in an unnatural manner, as if they were not in control of their own bodies. Accounts spread of a single word, written on a bathroom mirror: choose. Various theories began to emerge in the years following the closure of the case, some of them within the realm of conventional criminal investigation, others pushing toward the unusual or unexplained. One theory suggested that Sarah and Michael had been drugged, either by someone in the hotel or through something they had consumed, and that the altered manner of their movement shown in the footage was the result of drug intoxication. But this theory had significant problems. Toxicology tests on the blood evidence found in the suite had not revealed the presence of drugs. There was no clear indication of how they would have been drugged or by whom, and the movement patterns shown in the footage were not consistent with typical drug intoxication. Another theory suggested that they had been hypnotized or subjected to some form of psychological manipulation that made them compliant and willing to leave the room and descend into the service areas of the hotel. But this theory, while more consistent with their apparently voluntary movement, seemed to strain credulity. How would someone hypnotize two people in a hotel room and make them leave voluntarily? What would be the purpose? And how would they have then transported the couple away from the hotel without being seen or detected? A third theory, more disturbing and more speculative, suggested that what the security footage showed was something that defied conventional explanation. Some people who had seen descriptions of the footage began to suggest that Sarah and Michael's movements were not consistent with normal human activity, that something unusual, something beyond conventional criminal investigation, had occurred. Some people, operating in the shadows of internet forums that would emerge in the 1990s and 2000s, began to discuss theories involving paranormal phenomena. Some suggested that the couple had been possessed by external forces or entities. Some suggested that they had been abducted by extraterrestrials. Some suggested that they had been victims of some kind of occult ritual or activity. Some suggested that they had been subjected to a form of mind control so advanced that it seemed to defy the boundaries of known science. While these theories may sound far-fetched, they emerged partly in response to the official suppression of information. When legitimate questions go unanswered, when evidence is hidden, when official investigations are mysteriously halted, when people are warned not to pursue investigation further, people begin to look for alternative explanations. In the absence of official truth, speculation fills the void. What was clear was that something had happened in that hotel room, and in that hotel that the British authorities found so disturbing that they felt compelled to classify the evidence and suppress the investigation rather than pursue it to its conclusion. The question that remained, 4 decades later, was, what was that something? In 1998, nearly 13 years after the disappearance, a retired Scotland Yard detective named James Morrison decided to speak publicly about the case. Morrison had not been directly involved in the investigation, but he had read the files when they were being organized in the archives. He had been disturbed by what he had read, and by the evidence that the investigation had been deliberately suppressed. Morrison gave an interview to a BBC documentary program about unsolved cases. In the interview, Morrison described, in general terms, the nature of the investigation and the evidence that had led to the decision to close the case. He did not reveal classified information, but he made clear that official decisions had been made to suppress rather than to investigate. Morrison stated, "Something happened in that hotel that frightened very senior people. I cannot say more than that. But the speed with which the case was closed, the manner in which evidence was classified, the way in which promising investigative leads were blocked, all of this points to a decision being made at high levels that the truth should not be pursued. Whether that truth involves criminal activity, whether it involves governmental knowledge of something unusual, whether it involves something else entirely, I cannot say. But I can say with certainty that a deliberate decision was made to prevent the case from being solved." Morrison's willingness to speak led to renewed public interest in the case. Questions were raised in Parliament about why a case involving the disappearance of 2 private citizens should be classified as a matter of national security. Journalists began to pursue the story more aggressively. The official position began to shift slightly. Instead of maintaining that the case was simply a closed matter with no further information available, officials began to suggest that there were national security implications to the case that prevented full disclosure. This raising of national security as a justification for suppressing information about the disappearance of 2 private citizens only deepened speculation about what might have really happened. What possible national security implications could a young couple's disappearance have? What could they have stumbled upon? What could they have known? What had they encountered in that hotel room? In 2005, exactly 20 years after the disappearance, the British government released some information about the case through the Freedom of Information Act. What was released was carefully redacted and limited in scope, but it did confirm several important facts: that the investigation had been closed prematurely, that there had been official decisions to suppress investigation into certain leads, that evidence had been classified for reasons of national security, and that Detective Chief Inspector Thorne had objected to the closure of the case in writing. But the most significant evidence, the security footage, remained classified. The footage has never been released to the public. No official explanation has been given for why a tape of security camera footage taken in a hotel lobby and hallway should be classified as a matter of national security.